Hey, so in this video, we're going to talk about why older people who are getting married do prenups. Okay, so I'm Paul Rabelais. I'm an estate planning attorney. I help our clients get and keep their legal affairs in order. And I'm going to give you primarily the Louisiana version of this discussion. If you live in another state, maybe some other state rules apply, but you'll get the gist of it by watching this. Okay, the background is, it's common these days for older people to get married. People are living longer. People get divorced, people lose their spouses to death, and so it's common for people in their 50s, their late 50s, their 60s, even their 70s, some even in their 80s, to get married. Now, and it is also common for those spouses who are getting married to each other to also have children from their prior marriage or marriages or relationships. So why do those older couples do prenups? And I call it a prenup. You could call it a marriage contract. You could call it a separate property agreement. There's a number of different terms for it, but I'm just going to call it prenup or prenuptial agreement, because that's what I think most people refer to it as. Why do older couples who are getting married do prenups? Well, it's typically not, or maybe it shouldn't be, for the same reason that younger couples do prenups. Couples in their 20s, their 30s, those couples typically do prenups for the primary reason is because it's in contemplation of divorce. If we're 30 years old and we're getting married, and if we get divorced, this is what happens. Old people in general don't get divorced. They're maybe more mature, more set. It's kind of more of a maybe even kind of a companionship thing. They just don't get divorced. But they do the prenup not in contemplation of divorce, but they do it so that when one of them dies, everybody knows who owns what. Let me give you an example. And again, the Louisiana version. So let's say James and Bridget meet. They both have children. Let's say they both have 2 children to keep it simple. James is 65 years old and Bridget is 62 years old. James has a little bit of a nest egg. He's got about $1.5 million. Bridget, bringing into the marriage, she has about $50,000. So they don't do a prenup. And then after the marriage, James keeps working. And at the time they get married, they're focusing somewhat on what happens when they die. So they each write wills leaving their respective estate to their kids when they die. They are like, and maybe even James, because he has a larger estate, maybe in his will he does leave a bequest to Bridget to give her something if he happens to die first, but they don't do a prenup. Okay, so after they get married, James brought in $1.5 million, Bridget brought in $50,000, James keeps working. And James keeps investing, and his investments produce some interest and some dividends. And then about, let's say 10 years after they get married, Bridget dies. She got married at 62, she dies at 72. Well, here's what happens when Bridget dies. Here's what likely happens, because it's likely that Bridget's kids don't have a real close relationship with James, because Bridget's kids were out on their own when Bridget met James and when Bridget married James. And plus, Bridget's kids just don't like James in general. So here's what happened when James and Bridget didn't do a prenup, and they were married for 10 years. Okay, so here's the law. Assets acquired prior to the marriage are the separate property, of the spouse who brings them into the marriage. So at the moment they got married, James had $1.5 million of separate property, and Bridget had $50,000 that was her separate property. Now here's where it starts to get a little tricky. Our rules in Louisiana say the natural and civil fruits of the separate property of a spouse are community property. All right, so After they got married, James kept investing. His investments produced some interest. It produced some dividends. Those got reinvested, all went back into the same account. And James kept working. And because they had no prenup, all those earnings, all that compensation James made also was community property. And then here's the kicker, and all that got thrown back into James's accounts that were in James's name. So here's the kicker: is our law in Louisiana says that where separate and community funds are commingled, so that the amount of the separate funds cannot be differentiated from that of the community funds, all funds are characterized as community. All right. So James brought in $1.5 million into the marriage, and he kept working, and those earnings that he made were community property that got mixed up with his separate property, and his separate property produced some natural and civil fruits, which also got mixed up with the separate property, and all that got mixed up. 10 years later, James dies. Nobody knows what's his separate, nobody knows what's his community, so it all becomes community. Here comes Bridget's kids. They want half of James's money, and they just might be able to get it. So it doesn't matter. I sit here and I listen to these people, and I listen to these couples, and I listen to the children of these couples who sit across the table from me and say, well, we got married and we kept everything separate. He had his accounts and she had her accounts. And so in their mind, that's what determines, separate property. He had accounts that were in his name. She had accounts that were in her name. That does not determine what's separate and what's community. After James got married and he earned money, those earnings were community property, even though he put it in accounts that were just in James' name. So under that scenario, no prenup, Bridget dies, Bridget's kids want half of the accounts that are in James's name, and they just might get it. So if, on the other hand, James and Bridget had done the typical prenup marriage contract, separate property agreement, and again, the terms of the agreement matter, but if it was the typical agreement that says what James brings into the marriage is James's separate property, what Bridget brings into the marriage is Bridget's separate property, what James earns is James's separate property, what Bridget earns is hers, any natural and civil fruits produced by their assets are theirs, and what any natural and civil fruits that Bridget's estate produces is hers. May even go to say that if James incurs debts, those are his debts only. It's not a community debt. Then when you have that marriage contract or prenup in place that way, and then it's real clear. What's James's is James's, what's Bridget's is Bridget's, and when Bridget dies 10 years after the marriage, and Bridget has a will leaving her estate to her kids are only entitled to those things that are in Bridget's name because they had no community property. The prenup, the marriage contract, did away with the what's called community property regime, and everything was separate. Maybe they even co-owned an item. Maybe they bought a car together. Maybe they bought a house together. And our rules would say that, well, half of that is James's separate property and half of that is Bridget's separate property, assuming they had that marriage contract in place that was consistent with that kind of thing. All right, so that's the primary reason why older married couples do prenups, not necessarily in contemplation of divorce, but in contemplation of one or both of them dying, and a determination at that time having to be made as to who owns what. And that really protects the surviving spouse, it protects the children of the marriage, and just makes things cleaner and doesn't involve all this vagueness that is involved when you don't know what's community property and what's separate property when a marriage contract doesn't exist. Okay, so enough there. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss anything. Give it a thumbs up if you thought it provided you with some value. I'm going to be giving these educational videos, cranking them out regularly. I hope it helps. Y'all have a great day. See you next time.